Hello, this is Trish Smith, ecologist with the Nature Conservancy of California, along with Dr. Winston Vickers, Associate Veterinarian with UC Davis Wildlife Health Center. Welcome to the Interstate 15 Wildlife Crossing virtual field trip in Riverside County, California. Proposed wildlife crossings here along a 6-mile stretch of I-15 will provide a critical missing link that will reconnect the coastal Santa Ana Mountains to the west of I-15 with the interior Palomar and Peninsula ranges to the east of I-15 at the Riverside and San Diego County border. Drone footage provides a glimpse of the diverse habitats supported in the Santa Ana to Palomar Mountains linkage, including coastal sage scrub, grasslands, chaparral, oak and riparian woodlands. The linkage includes the Santa Margarita River, one of Southern California's longest free-flowing rivers. Santa Ana to Palomar Mountains linkage, along with the San Bernardino to Joshua Tree linkage, where the proposed SR62 wildlife crossings are located, are 2 of the 15 South Coast missing linkages identified by SC Wildlands in the early 2000s. If protected and connected, this network of landscape scale linkages could secure landscape scale connectivity for wildlife between the US-Mexico border and the southern Sierra Nevada. This map of Southern California shows the locations of the South Coast missing linkages in green and the locations of the SR62 and I-15 wildlife crossing projects. We have also highlighted the location of the proposed Liberty Canyon Highway 101 crossing in LA County as reference, as many of you are likely familiar with that project. That linkage too is one of the South Coast missing linkages known as the Santa Monica Mountains to Sierra Madre Mountains linkage. The need for the Santa Ana to Palomar Mountains linkage was first identified by Dr. Paul Beyer, who led the first Santa Ana Mountains mountain lion study between 1988 and 1992. Dr. Beyer radio collared and tracked 32 mountain lions over the 4-year study period. Dr. Beyer's study revealed that I-15 east of the Santa Ana Mountains is an impenetrable barrier to wildlife, and particularly mountain lions, and that although the Santa Ana Mountains are large at roughly 600,000 acres, it's not large enough to sustain a healthy mountain lion population. Any efforts to protect lions, he said, must include connections eastward across busy I-15 to the Palomar and Eastern Peninsula ranges of San Diego County and beyond. If this connection isn't made, he estimated in 1992 that mountain lions would be lost from the Santa Ana Mountains within 100 years. Beyer's work formed the foundation for the design of the Santa Ana Mountains to Palomar Mountains linkage, shown here, as developed by SC Wildlands and partners. The Nature Conservancy and other NGOs, as well as agencies such as the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Riverside County, and San Diego County, as well as many others, have been working to secure lands in the linkage for over 3 decades. And while much of the linkage focus relates to mountain lions, the linkage design targets connectivity needs of over 20 focal species, from the arroyo chub to the red diamond rattlesnake to butterflies to mountain lions. I will now hand over the presentation to Winston Vickers, who will discuss mountain lion and wildlife crossing research that he and his collaborators have been working on for the last 20 years in the greater linkage area.
Thanks, Trish. That was a nice introduction to the subject, and thanks for introducing me. So I'm going to dive right into illustrating some of the science that supports the work here to try to improve the I-15 crossing structure and crossing effectiveness. So I'm going to share my screen. What science brought us here? Trish talked about Paul Beyer's work. Holly Ernest did the first genetic analysis that really illustrated statewide mountain lion structure, and included some samples of Paul's from the Santa Anas that tended, even though those sample numbers were small, they indicated that there was genetic isolation occurring in the Santa Anas and potentially a significant lack of diversity. Other studies across the region kept pointing to this area as being a key area of connectivity between the Eastern Peninsula Range and the Santa Anas. And then our study began in 2000 and started adding mountain lion data to the sort of pile of information that has brought us here. Our data, when illustrated on a map or put on a map, that's all the dark dots there on the map of the region, illustrate that there's two big clusters of information there. There's the Santa Ana cluster west of I-15, the Eastern Peninsula cluster east of I-15, and that the two hardly meet. Actually, there's one little tiny group of dots that cross, but we've only had one animal cross I-15 wearing a GPS collar, which is kind of amazing, thinking about the 100 or so that we've had collars on, that none of those except one have crossed. And so that data has given us a lot of good information about movement on the landscape. And then the opportunity to sample all those animals and others that have been killed for genetic samples allowed us to add our samples to the statewide analysis by Cal Gustafson that illustrates how fragmented the populations across all of California are into actually 10 distinct populations, mostly separated by development or highways. And so the Santa Ana population is down here in the lower portion. If you can see my arrow in that kind of blue-green dot down there. So it's a small population but very isolated from all the rest. And that isolation is illustrated here as well. In the Santa Anas, we have their samples in this analysis clustered out here by themselves, the Eastern Peninsula Range, pretty much by themselves, and the San Gabriels and San Bernardinos, and which is amazing because you think these three mountain ranges have been separated just by 300 or 400 feet of highway, and yet these populations are distinct from each other, and that's a great concern. And you wouldn't think highways alone would do that, but they do, along with the associated development. So the inbreeding depression analysis was done, or not, a population viability analysis was done relating to the Santa Anas to see what the real risk was to that population of actual extirpation because of isolation, inbreeding depression potentially, and high mortality rates that we've documented there, mostly from cars. And he found that the danger was high of extirpation within a relatively short time. The blue line is the Santa Anas, the red is the Santa Monica Mountains population. Both are at risk of extirpation within a 15-year period if inbreeding depression has a significant impact on the population, reducing reproductive capacity and kitten survival. So we know that happened in Florida panthers. We know that these populations are almost as inbred as Florida panthers. So this is a great concern to us and accelerates the need to do something at this highway. Inbreeding depression signs are starting to show up just a little bit in the population. So again, everything we find out keeps emphasizing the need to do something. Using that data, Kathy Zeller was able to model disperser flow across the landscape. Again, that points toward this area on the map. If you can see my arrow, it's right here. Here's Temecula and Temecula Creek. And so this area just south of Temecula Creek is important. Also, the San Luis Rey River down here is important, but there's very little connectivity from there to the north. The only place where there's connectivity between conserved lands directly that attach or connected to the main body of both mountain ranges is there just south of Temecula. And if the data, she used the data to model least cost path across the highways in the region, and you can see that not only I-15 needs to be crossed, but multiple other highways. And this is the dark dots are modeled crossings. The lighter dots are confirmed crossings that we confirmed with our data. So the whole region is covered with this network of highways that mountain lions are at high risk of getting hit when they're crossing them, just to get to I-15 to connect across the two populations. So we have multiple layers of concerns. And to address the roadkill aspect, Caltrans along I-15 is building a fence project, and that's going to help a lot with roadkill. But then the key then is having good crossings to cross under, and that's the deficiency that we have in this area. So if we look at the area a little more closely, again, you can see the dots denoting the GPS data that we have. The red squiggle is the Temecula Creek area and the Temecula Creek crossing. And if we look at that area, that crossing is up to the north of the top of this picture. These camera symbols are where we have cameras on the landscape to document where mountain lions are approaching the highway. And we do get photos on both sides of the highway with mountain lions being nearby, but we haven't with cameras documented any crossings. This is an illustration of the type of culverts that are there. They're very steep. They're large enough, but they're very steep, and the animals can't see through them. They descend steeply and then flatten out, so there's not the ability to see all the way through. And most animals don't enter them and pass through. This mountain lion rejected it, and we find that with lots of other animals. They do exist on the sides of the roadway. This animal had been doing some hunting there by the roadway. This camera is right by I-15. So mountain lion there has a coyote in his mouth. So it's a hunting ground. It's a place they can get water, at least at some times of the year. And so they do come around. And that was a key thing we wanted to find out. If something was structured or a structure was built, would there be animals there to use it? And we know from all of this work that they certainly are. These arrows are all the places where we've gotten mountain lion photos on both sides of the highway. Temecula Creek Bridge up at the top. That land to the south is where we have conserved lands on both sides, thanks to the Nature Conservancy on the east and the Santa Margarita Reserve on the west. So our cameras in the structure itself and underneath and on either side have been illustrative as well, showing us lots and lots of human presence. So as this drone footage shows, that there's tagging under there. Our photos have shown people in there a lot, and camping and just various activities. You can see somebody's built a tree house in there, so or a couple of tree houses. And so it's a very, very busy place from the standpoint of humans. This is a photo that was taken very near the bridge, animal going west. It may have come under the bridge from the east, but we didn't catch a photo of it on the east side. So it may have just come up to the bridge and turned around. This animal, we know for sure did that. This is a collared female, disperser age, and she came up to the bridge. The bridge is to the right. This camera is right by the bridge. So she came very close to the bridge, but her collar data and the camera data suggests that she just turned around and left. So she did not cross under. This illustrates that other work that needs to be done and is being done to find where best to construct any kind of a crossing from the approach perspective, where we can minimize or know that light and sound impacts would be less at certain points in the landscape. So light propagation is on the left, noise propagation on the right. This is work done by Fraser Schilling and Travis Longcore, and initially by Amy Collins and myself to map this out and look at where on the landscape things might be most amenable to a new crossing structure. And the other thing we're doing is monitoring the population in the Santa Anas. This is the Santa Anas with a grid laid over the conserved lands, which are all in different colors. And in each of those grids, we are putting a hair snare type structure of one type or another, along with cameras to get good photos of the animals, to attempt to get photo recognition capability to understand or track individual animals that way, which is hard with mountain lions. And then get hair samples for DNA. You can see down below, this female in this case was going underneath that hair snare, which was just a roller with sticky substance on it. And we're using sticky material to capture hair in other ways. This is a scent post with an individual rubbing on it. And here an individual investigating a call and a scent post and stepping over some tape material that can snag hair. And then here's an individual that decided not to leave hair for us, but a good picture as he or she rested in the sun or in the shade there. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Trish.
So after 30 years of protecting habitat and conducting research in the linkage, it's only been in the last few years that we've been able to secure the protected lands needed on both sides of I-15 to allow planning for wildlife crossings to move forward. As Winston mentioned, data and expert opinion have prioritized 2 locations for enhanced or new wildlife crossing structures. One at the north end to enhance the function of the existing Temecula Creek Bridge, shown at the bottom of the screen, and 2 miles to the south, a location for a new wildlife under or over crossing. In 2019, UC Davis received a planning grant to work with student teens from Cal Poly Pomona School of Civil Engineering and Caltrans to develop concepts and feasibility studies for up to 3 wildlife crossings along I-15 in the linkage, including upgrading the Temecula Creek Bridge underpass, designing a standalone vegetated overcrossing, and adapting an underground culvert. Temecula Creek Bridge crossing in the northern end of the linkage currently serves as the only viable crossing between the 2 mountain ranges and is the only riparian connection in the linkage that will serve the needs of both aquatic and terrestrial wildlife to move and adapt in response to threats such as climate change. Temecula Creek is in the upper watershed of the Santa Margarita River, which is a major wildlife movement route that supports numerous endangered and sensitive species, such as southwestern pond turtle, arroyo toad, and steelhead trout. To the east of I-15, Temecula Creek connects to Pechanga Creek, which flows out of the Palomar Mountains. Because riparian areas are natural dispersal corridors that provide elevational gradients and cooler climate refugia, Temecula Creek has the potential to allow a variety of species the ability to move in response to a warming climate. Despite its values, Temecula Creek currently does not appear functional for many wildlife species due to several issues, the biggest of which is chronic human presence in the linkage, including taggers, swimmers, hunters, hikers, and campers. And these uses bring with them associated trash and debris, which further deter wildlife and degrade water quality. In addition, invasive exotic plants such as pampas grass can be inhospitable to wildlife and choke water flows, while traffic noise associated with I-15 and adjoining residential areas is also likely deterring wildlife use of this crossing area. To address these challenges at Temecula Creek, Cal Poly Pomona student engineers put together concept plans to enhance the function of Temecula Creek as a wildlife corridor that included fencing to keep humans out, exotic plant control and noise abatement measures such as sound baffles on the underside of the bridge and dense native plantings to reduce traffic noise. Nature Conservancy has since received a $378,000 grant from the State of California Wildlife Conservation Board to conduct baseline vegetation and wildlife studies for the Temecula Creek area and to take the Cal Poly concepts for fencing, restoration, and noise abatement to the next step of detailed plans and specs and permitting to get us to a shovel-ready project. Moving about 2 miles to the south of Temecula Creek is our second wildlife crossing location that many crossing experts over the years have pointed to as a great location for a new wildlife overcrossing, and where we now have protected lands on both sides of the highway. The Santa Margarita Ecological Reserve sits on the west side of the highway, and the Nature Conservancy's newly acquired Rainbow Canyon property sits on the east side of the highway. Here, there are elevated benches on either side of the highway that could support a vegetated wildlife overcrossing structure. A little to the north of this location is another potential crossing location where drainages meet at the highway edge and could support a new wildlife undercrossing. Cal Poly performed engineering, feasibility, and preliminary design concepts for both an overcrossing and an undercrossing, with the overcrossing shown here spanning 10 lanes of highways and up to 160 feet wide. Students estimated that the cost for this overcrossing was about $17 to $26 million, not including labor. The undercrossing designed by Cal Poly Pomona here could either be a 12-foot box culvert or an 8 by 11-foot arched corrugated pipe, both with soil on the bottom. Students estimated the cost of each of these to be about $9 million apiece, not including labor. Students also investigated the potential for a larger arched culvert with a natural bottom for this location, but this was deemed not to be feasible in this location because it would require the freeway to be shut down to perform a cut and cover operation. Whereas the culvert designs presented here would only require one lane to be shut down in each direction and could be done as a jack and bore operation. Right now, Caltrans is taking the plans for the under and overcrossing to the next step and recently received a $1.3 million State of California Wildlife Conservation Board grant to produce a project initiation document, environmental and alternatives analysis for the overcrossing and undercrossing concepts. This project and the Temecula Creek Planning Grant, along with a recent wildlife exclusion fencing that Caltrans has constructed from Temecula Creek South to the San Diego County line, are putting us well on our way to securing habitat connectivity across the I-15. And finally, we would like to thank these agencies for funding and support that is making wildlife connectivity across Interstate 15 in the Santa Ana to Palomar linkage a future reality.